So it's Genesis chapter 45, verse 1 to begin. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine. And behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. So you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. And then skipping to verse 25. Then they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan, to Jacob their father. And they told him, saying, "Joseph is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt." And Jacob's heart stood still, because he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. Excuse me. Then Israel said, "It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Amen.
We've been spending some time, haven't we, in Genesis, looking at this lovely story that we find here about Joseph and his interaction with his brothers and with his family. And we looked last week at the wonderful ending of chapter 44, where Judah, the very brother who had given the instructions to sell Joseph as a slave, that same brother now intercedes and pleads for Benjamin. And Joseph sees that there's been a complete change of heart. And Judah actually gets to the point where he says, "Look, let me take Benjamin's place." He volunteered himself into slavery. Absolutely lovely, those verses we find in chapter 44 from verse 18 on. And it's no coincidence that the Bible records all of that speech from Judah to us. You see, it didn't just touch Joseph's heart, it touched the heart of God as well. Just like to remind ourselves of just the last few verses we find there at the end of chapter 44. So picking it up from verse 32 to 34. "For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, 'If I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that will come upon my father?'" And that's just the ending of this lovely pleading that comes from Judah's heart for Benjamin. And the impact that had is quite astonishing. And I wanted to remind ourselves of it because there's a chapter right there, but really you have to understand that what we're then reading is immediately the events that followed after Judah had opened up his heart. And it tells us in verse 1 of chapter 45, then, straight after Judah's pleading, then Joseph could not restrain himself. It just burst from him. That lovely openness of heart that came from Judah was reciprocated. Whereas Joseph up to this point had been very guarded and he was remaining unknown to his brethren. He was deliberately keeping it a secret as to who he was because he didn't know if he could trust them. He didn't know if they had changed. He didn't know if they were still the same people that had sold him into slavery 22 years before. And he has come up with an incredible plan just to try and get Benjamin back with him safe in Egypt, where Joseph can look after him. And within Joseph's human heart, he is just thinking about Benjamin's safety and Benjamin's security. And yet he is amazed at the heart of God. And we're always amazed at the heart of God, because God's heart is always bigger than us. Always bigger. Always has a bigger heart. And whereas Joseph sent his servants to go and arrest Benjamin for stealing the cup that had been planted in Benjamin's sack, he expected just Benjamin to come back. But remember, we looked last week at how amazed he would have been to see every single one of the brothers come back with him. If Benjamin was to go back to Egypt, we all go. All of us. Without exception, without disagreement, they all came back. And how lovely that would have been for Joseph to see that whereas 22 years ago they were quite happy to see the back of Joseph, now they will not leave Benjamin on his own. And then that has been added to by this wonderful plea that comes from Judah's heart. And all of a sudden, all the thoughts and plans that Joseph had are just all put to one side. And he just allows himself the freedom of showing them who he really is. Joseph could not restrain himself. But look what he did before he announces who he is. It tells us there, make everyone go out from me. He asked everybody to leave. It was just him and his brothers. There were things here that he needed to talk about that were embarrassing. There were things that he needed to reveal that were shameful. But he didn't want to cause any more embarrassment than was needed. And there was no need for others to know about what they didn't know about. We could learn a lot from that in life, couldn't we? Keeping things within tight circles, not gossiping, not spreading further, not allowing people's embarrassment and shame to be made more painful than it really is. And this is the heart that Joseph has towards his brothers. What they did was a terrible thing. But he's not looking for revenge. And he's not looking for public shaming either. He's looking for a reconciliation. And we always see that with God, don't we? That when we fail, and we all fail, and when we fall, he's not looking for public embarrassment and shame. He's looking for reconciliation. He's looking to draw us back. He's looking to get us back up on our feet again. And this is the heart that Joseph has too. Everybody else leave. There are things I need to talk to with my brothers. He doesn't say that. It's just from his actions. Now we have the wonderful benefit of hindsight, but I want you to try and come with me back into that room. Put yourself in the shoes of Judah and his brothers. Judah has just made this incredible plea for Benjamin. And he is replied to with a statement, everybody out. Judah doesn't know where this is going. The brothers don't know where this is going. Everybody out. And then what happens next in verse 2, again, bear in mind, Joseph has not said a word yet. It just tells us that he weeps out loud. So as far as the brothers are concerned, the governor, who they don't know is Joseph, has just sent everybody away and he has just burst into tears. You see, sometimes our emotions just can't be held back anymore and it just bursts from us. And it might have caught Joseph as much by surprise as it did his brothers. So they're in this room with the man who they think is the governor. They meet a plea for Benjamin's safety, and all they have is just him and them, and he is just weeping and weeping and weeping. And then, and only then, does Joseph actually speak and say anything to them. And what he says literally shocks them to the very core of their being. I am Joseph. They didn't see that coming in a million years. I am Joseph. The revelation that hit them. This person that we've been dealing with, that we thought was a bureaucrat, that we thought was just an important Egyptian governor. He's the brother that we sold into slavery 22 years before. He has the power over the whole land. Only Pharaoh has more power than him. And we now stand before him, alone. Where's this going? What's it going to lead to? You can imagine all the thoughts that are tumbling around in their minds as Joseph simply says, I am Joseph. And then look what's in his heart. Does my father still live? How is Dad? That's his heart. He's seen Benjamin, he knows that Benjamin is safe, and the two people that he's always inquired about is his brother Benjamin and his father. And they're speechless. But we tell us in verse 3, they cannot answer him a single word. And not only are they speechless, they are utterly dismayed in his presence. Why are they dismayed? Why does it dismay them to learn that the brother that they sold into slavery is actually alive and God has prospered him and he's doing well? Why is that dismay in them? Because they're doing what we all do. They're looking at it through their lens. They're looking at it, well, what does this mean to me? If we have treated him so bad, and if we sold him into slavery, and he now has all this power, what's coming on our heads? What's coming our way? Martin mentioned when he was convening last week about the weight of guilt, and it comes out throughout the story, the weight of guilt. And we feel that weight, don't we? And Satan tells us that that guilt should drive us away from God's presence. Just as Adam hid himself away in the garden when he sinned against God, guilt and sin seeks to drive us away from God. As we heard this morning, as we're looking at Romans, Christ has come to take our guilt and shame away. That we don't need to flee and run, but we can stand in his presence. The brothers are in utter shock and dismay at what they're hearing. So much so that they've stepped back. They've retreated from him. Because in verse 4 it tells us that Joseph says, please come near to me. Oh, that must have been so nice for them to hear that. Please, come near to me. And again, as we often say with Joseph, he is such a type of Christ, isn't it? And how often do you feel guilt and shame? Because your actions are known, because your heart is known. And we feel like shrinking back. And yet Christ is saying, come near. Come near. I know your frame. I know how you're made. But I love you in spite of who you are, not because of who you are. My love for you doesn't alter. My love for you is based on relationship, not on your actions. I love you. And Joseph's brothers realized this day that their brother loved them. In spite of all that had gone on, in spite of all the problems that they had thrown at him, it didn't change his relationship. He still saw them as brothers. Please, come near to me. And so they came near. And then he said something to convince them that he is Joseph. What does he say to them? What does he say that only Joseph would know? I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. You see, he's not saying it to put the knife in. He's not saying it to open that wound again. This was the closely guarded secret that the brothers had shared with no one. Not even their father was privy to this. Nobody knew what had really happened to Joseph. You see, they dipped his multicoloured coat in sheep's blood. They'd allowed their father to think that for 22 years he had been attacked by a wild animal while on an errand for his father. Nobody outside of that circle of brothers knew what had really happened to Joseph. The only other person who did know was Joseph. And he uses that knowledge to impress upon them that he is who he claims to be. I am Joseph, your brother, whom you did sell into Egypt. And look how he follows that up. Look how much he understands their hearts and what is going on in their thoughts and with their minds. But now, he's mentioned the taboo subject. He's mentioned their betrayal of him. He's mentioned his sale into slavery. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. You see, God knows our heart. God understands what we think. He knows our thoughts. And Joseph knew his brothers well. I don't want you grieving. I don't want you angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Because that's how he worded it at first. You sold me. With the weight and the consequences that covers. But look how he ends the verse. Verse 5. I don't want you to be grieved or angry that you sold me, because God sent me. What a wonderful revelation this is to Joseph's heart. Yes, he understands that they sold him. He sees that. But he sees God's hand even in this. You were selling me, but God was sending me. And he uses that phrase 3 times. 3 times he reminds them, God sent me. Didn't change their actions. Didn't alter what they had done. But it showed that there is a God in heaven who overrules everything. And as we often sing, he turns things that are meant for our evil into our good. And his brothers didn't do it out of any thought of love at all. The exact opposite. Their motives and actions were completely wrong. But God always knew what they would do. And God always planned to use what they would do. And Joseph is able to do this. He's able to step back. And he's able to see the bigger picture. He's able to see beyond the immediate actions. And he's able to see God is in it all. What an incredible revelation this is to his brothers. What a wonderful way of talking to them about the series of events that they all know happened. Yes, what you did was a terrible thing, but God has overruled everything. And you were selling me. No two ways about it. He doesn't dodge that. He doesn't sweep it under the carpet. He addresses it honestly. But he says, please don't beat yourselves up about it. Because God overrules. And God sent me. And then he shows what he now understands as to why God sent him. Why did he have to be sold as a slave? Why did he have to serve in Potiphar's house? Why did he have to go into prison? Why did he stand before Pharaoh? Why has he been made second in command with total authority over all the food stores? Because God wants him to preserve life. They were seeking to extinguish his life. If you look back at the conversations 22 years before they decided to sell him, the first idea was to kill him. They wanted to be rid of him. They wanted him to go. They were seeking to extinguish life. And yet Joseph is there and he's saying, God has done all of this to preserve life. God has come to give life. Then he explains to them what is going on behind the scenes that they are totally oblivious to. He explains to them what God has shown to Pharaoh and what God has shown to Joseph. that these 2 years of extreme famine is but the start of it. There's another 5 years to come. And God has arranged for Joseph to be there, so that when Pharaoh has the dream in Egypt, Joseph can interpret the dream for him. And not only Egypt would be saved, but all those nations round and about would benefit from the food source that Joseph was able to build up. There's something that's easy to miss in verse 6. It tells us that not only would the famine last for another 5 years, but in Egypt there was no ploughing and no harvesting for those 5 years. You see, if you've had a year or two of famine, and you've only got a little grain left, and you didn't know you were going to have a famine, and you haven't stocked up, the problem is you waste more grain. Because even the little that you have, you plant, and you put into the soil. But the famine comes again. And even the bit that you had is gone. But the Egyptians are not wasting any of their grain. They're not bothering to plough and plant because they know, they believe what God has told them, that the famine is going to go on for 7 years. So keep the grain that you've got. He explains to his brothers for the first time, this famine is not just for 2 years, it's for 7 years. And there's another 5 years to come. That is why, what does he follow up with verse 7? God sent me. You see, he sees the link between the situation that they face and the provision that God has made. God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you, to save your lives by a great deliverance. What a wonderful phrase that is. God has sent me to save your lives. He sees that God's heart is so much bigger. He sees that the provision of food is not just for him and Benjamin, but it's for all the brothers. Even when he had the plan to put the cup in Benjamin's sack and for Benjamin to be returned to him, he always had the plan that his brothers would have food and go back to the father in peace. Never sought any evil on the brothers. But he didn't understand that God's heart was for all of them to be safe with him in Egypt. It wasn't a case of Benjamin now being protected by Joseph in Egypt and the other brothers being there in Canaan. No, God's heart was the whole family would be together and would still be kept safe, and they would all be sheltered here now in Egypt. This is God's plan for prosperity and deliverance. And Joseph is becoming awakened to how big the heart of God is. It says again in verse 8, it was not you who sent me here, but God. So for the third time, he reinforces that point of view. It is God who has sent me. And then he tells them to go and to take back home some wonderful, wonderful news. Remember, back home is Jacob. Back home is Jacob. And Jacob is fretting. He's looking out for Benjamin coming home. And they're being delayed. And father is really fretful. He was very reluctant to release Benjamin to them anyway. On their first journey, Benjamin wasn't there. On their second journey, they would only be given grain if Benjamin was with them. And he reluctantly released him out of his hand. As I mentioned the other week, we have to understand what is playing on Jacob's mind. Because of the lies, because of the lack of honesty that has come from Joseph's brothers, they've allowed their father to think that for 22 years he sent his son to his death. For 22 years he thinks the errand I gave Joseph to do was the very thing that led to his death. And it scars him. So much so that Benjamin is never allowed out of his sight. And yet now his hand has been forced by this famine. He's had to release Benjamin. And he's waiting at home. And he's just praying that Benjamin will be safe. The only son left from the same mother. Joseph and Benjamin were the only two full brothers. The others were half-brothers with a different mother. He's already lost Joseph, and he fears that he's going to lose Benjamin. Joseph turns to his brothers now and says, "Go back home and tell Father, your son Joseph, your son Joseph is alive. He's there in Egypt. Don't tarry, quickly come. And bring your children and your children's children. God is going to protect us, not just us, but the generations that are yet to come." Again, Joseph sees the bigness of God's heart, the largeness of God's vision. This isn't just a temporary thing, just for the 7 years of famine. God is going to protect us here for generations. We heard from Andrew, didn't we? They were there for 400 years. By the time they left, this family of 12 boys had grown to millions. God was true to his word. We will be provided for, not just for the 5 years, but this is part of God's plan. For us to be established as a nation, for us to be here for generations. This is all of God's plan, all of God's doing. Don't forget that he still looks like an Egyptian. He's dressed like an Egyptian. He doesn't look anything like them. Doesn't look anything like they remember him. But then in verse 12 we read something, "Behold your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you." You see, he was now speaking to them in their tongue. And they didn't recognize who he was, but they knew who he was by his voice. I was reminded there of John 20, verse 16, where Mary Magdalene is at the tomb. Do you remember when Jesus has risen and she thinks he's the gardener? And then he says her name, Mary. And there's something in the speech, the way that he says her name, that she knows who he really is. And Joseph looks like an Egyptian, he's dressed like an Egyptian, but he talks like their brother. And they know who he is. After he has made this declaration and revealed to them all of the plan of God for their heart, what does he then do? Well, verse 14 is a lovely verse. It tells us that he falls on the neck of his brother Benjamin, and they just weep. And Benjamin weeps on his neck. They just hold each other with the embrace. And sometimes there is nothing that needs to be said. The emotions are enough. And for them to be reconciled. For him to see Benjamin again after 22 years is a wonderful thing. But Benjamin thinks he's been dead for 22 years. And now Benjamin is holding his brother as well. And there's just this outpouring of emotion. But it doesn't stop there. God's heart is big. Joseph's heart is big. After he is wept with Benjamin, what does the Bible tell us in verse 15? Moreover, he kissed all his brothers, and he wept over them. He wept over them. That emotion that he felt, the reconciliation, it's not just for Benjamin. It is for all of the brothers, every single one of them, without exception. And then it says, after that, his brothers talked with him. Can you imagine? I'm sure they all went to talk at the same time. You haven't seen him for 22 years. You've lived with the guilt that you sent him to his death. He now stands before you as the governor of all Egypt. And not only that, he's forgiven you. He's forgiven you. You've been forgiven. The weight of the guilt that they've been carrying for those 22 years, for the first time in 22 years, they're not feeling that weight. They can breathe again. He knows, but he still loves. He's still our brother. And then they've got 22 years to catch up on. Even a day can give you enough to talk about for a few hours. Can you imagine 22 years of catching up? What had happened to Joseph, what had happened to them. So much to talk about. And as reconciled families do, it just fell into that conversation, into that warmth. But Dad, needs to know, doesn't he? Dad needs to know as well. Wonderful for them to be there in the warmth of this reconciliation, but Dad is back in Canaan. So Pharaoh gives his agreement for them to come and to stay. And when Joseph sends his brothers to go and get Dad, to bring Dad home, look what it says to them in verse 24. Look how much he understands their humanness. See that you do not become troubled along the way. You see, while Joseph is there with them, everything's fine. But when they start making the long journey back to Canaan and the journey back down, all those little seeds of doubt, all those little whispering voices are going to come their way. Has he really forgiven you? Can you really start again? Whose fault is all this? Don't let those thoughts trouble you. Don't allow the past to rear its head again. Push them away. Look forward to the future that God has prepared for you. And we're prone to do that, aren't we? On the journey, on the path, after we've known forgiveness and after we've entered into that relationship with a loving Father, still have those little niggling doubts, don't we, that can trouble us about things in the past. And Satan always wants to make the past a ball and chain around our ankles to drag us back. But he has freed us from the past. Christ has freed us from the past. And we can look to a future with him. And the brothers can look to a future with Joseph. Can you imagine now the scene as they come back into Canaan? A difficult conversation, yes, but a lovely conversation as well. Joseph is still alive. Their father would have been so pleased to see the brothers coming back and the Benjamins with them. That is what he's been looking for. He's been just thinking, I hope Benjamin's going to be safe. I pray that Benjamin returns to me. And when they get back, what incredible news they bring. Not only is Benjamin safe, we've got news for you, Dad. Joseph is still alive. Incredible. Can you imagine, after 22 years of thinking that you sent your son to his death, running your errand, you suddenly find out that he's not dead, that he's alive. No wonder the Bible tells us that his heart stood still. He couldn't believe it. It's too good to be true. It says that he didn't believe them. How can this possibly be the case? And what is it that convinces them? What is it that they do to convince Dad that what they're saying is true? Verse 27 says, they told him all the words that Joseph had said to them. The wonderful revelation that Joseph had, the vision that God had given him, not just for the situation there, but the future vision for them as a family. They share that with him. And then he sees the carts, everything that has been sent back, to take all the provisions from Canaan back down into Egypt. And the Bible tells us, whereas his heart stood still, his heart now is revived. It's given fresh impetus. It's given new life. His heart is revived. It takes 20 years off him. And Israel says, and Israel is Jacob, as we know, that's Israel is his new name. Then Israel said, it is enough. I couldn't have asked for any more than this. There isn't anything that he would have wanted more than this, to have Joseph restored to him. It is enough. God, you are so good. How often do we give God thanks for his goodness to us? We heard again on Andrew's story about the children of Israel moaning that they didn't have enough. But Christ is enough. More than enough. We have everything if we have him. It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive, and I'm going to go and see him. He fairly skipped to Egypt, you know. Absolutely marvellous. What an utter change. Reluctant to let Benjamin go. Not only does he get Benjamin back, but his son Joseph, who he had long given up as dead, he is restored to him as well. It's a lovely, lovely story. No coincidence. that Genesis gives us so much detail about this story. And as we often say, there's a type going on, isn't there? We see Joseph as a type of Jesus. And just as I come to a close this evening, I just want to think about that typology. As wonderful as this story is on its own feet, as wonderful as this story reads, even within its own context, for us as believers, there's an even greater blessing for us, isn't it? Because what do we see in this story? Well, we see the favoured son being sent of the Father. He's on the Father's business. He's going about his Father's errand. We see the favoured son being sent by the Father. And he is rejected by his brethren. The brethren do not accept him, and they reject him, and they seek to remove him. We see Christ there, don't we? Christ who was sent by the Father and rejected by his brethren. And yet, in their rejection, in their very act of rejection, God provides for their life. God provides for their eternal well-being. The brothers rejected Joseph, sold him into slavery, got rid of him. Christ was rejected by his own, handed over to the Romans, nailed to a cross. In Joseph's rejection, he ended up in Israel. So he ended up in Egypt. He ended up in Egypt, and he was able there to provide food for the famine. Where did Christ end up in his rejection? He didn't end up on the cross, did he? He ended up being raised from the dead. He ended up defeating death, the very thing that was supposed to cause us so much angst and pain and separation from God. He removed the power of death from us so that we need no longer die. And we can receive the free gift of eternal life that Christ has secured for us. Joseph's brothers were now no longer to die from the famine, but they were to receive bread and they were to receive life from the very hand of Joseph, the one who they had betrayed. I thank God he had such a big heart. And yes, we do silly things. Yes, we do stupid things. Yes, we do sinful things. But God loves us. And his Son has been sent to die for us. And as we heard from Andrew, if we will but believe, if we will but look to the cross and believe, instead of death, life is promised to each and every one.